Another social service which needs some changes is transportation. Here is the poll on transportation. And now we'll hear from Eric Doherty explaining why we need to pay attention and reform some of our laws and regulations.
So I want to actually start with these little fellows. I think it's pretty well known in place in Washington State that oysters are no longer reproducing in the wild in Puget Sound. But interestingly, here where the fossil fuel interests are a little more dominant, our mainstream media has completely failed to cover the fact that our famous Fanny Bay oysters are no longer reproducing in the wild, and the industry is now in a position where they can't really expect to have a future raising oysters in the open ocean on the Pacific coast of Canada because the seawater is becoming too acidic. Simple equation of carbon dioxide and water is carbonic acid. And we're also looking at another situation in BC that's overlooked by many people in the mainstream media is that our forests, our forest industry in the interior has pretty much been decimated or worse by the pine beetle, which is closely linked to global warming. And the consequences of that are actually, people with real faces. This is the Burns Lake mill, which exploded because of trying to saw this dead beetle-killed wood, a result of global warming, in a mill that was designed to saw green lumber that doesn't produce the explosive dust that the pine beetle-killed wood does. And we can see this all over the world, that there are real consequences now to global warming. And this, I would trace this out to the fundamental desire for economic growth. I'm just going to run quickly through what some of the consequences of, and this is East Africa. That didn't stop in 2011. That was in the news in 2011. The situation has gotten worse since then. So basically my thesis is that the threat of the fossil fuel economy, the growth economy that depends on oil and fossil fuels, is not primarily the oil spills that so many mainstream environmentalists focus on. It's mainly the carbon dioxide emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions, that are the social and environmental threat. And transportation in Canada is about half of our total carbon footprint from fossil fuels. And that's the fossil fuel footprint that we can actually measure accurately. And I just want to point out that the fuel emissions, that's where the tar sands refining and extraction process emissions fit in. Until the Great Depression and World War II, even capitalist economists actually debated the question of whether economic growth was a necessary and permanent part of capitalism. During the Great Depression, a lot of industries were shut down. It was a severe crisis in capitalism. And at that time, before World War II, in Canadian cities, most people didn't need to own a car. The transportation systems were largely based on streetcars, interurban trains like this one. And what it meant was that people's material needs were fairly modest living in cities. After World War II, we had a situation where all those plants that had been idled, particularly automotive plants, were idled during the Depression. they've been brought back into full production during World War II. And the economic output, the throughput of materials was unprecedented. Challenge after that, how do you maintain that? How do you maintain those barrels of oil, tons of steel, tons of rubber, and keep that economic machine running and growing? So we have the advertising industry, the automobile industry, and most importantly, the road building, publicly funded road building industry, all came together to create what the need to consume steel, oil, rubber, all these things in order to have a decent existence. This ad, Canadian automobile ad, I think is indicative of the 1950s and the immediate post-war period. People bought into it, unions bought into it, people bought the cars. They borrowed the money and bought the cars. But it didn't take long before people discovered, we all discovered, that as you built the roads, people's quality of life actually deteriorated as the material consumption went up and up and up. So you had situations where instead of free-flowing roads with your lovely finned car on it, you sit in traffic. Now we have examples where roads, new freeways are congested before they're completed. The ring road around London is a famous example of that. They put billions and billions of pounds into expanding it. So I'm just putting this up about the Transportation Transformation Report because it's got some of the background information about what I'm talking about. And it's, to me, it's an important thing to draw in organizations like the Wilderness Committee and the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives into these big questions about how our society and our economy operates. Yeah, one of the conclusions from this report is that spending money on highways and transit at the same time is really like driving a car with your foot on the brake and your foot on the gas and pushing on both. In fact, the late Paul Meese, his work suggests that if you build freeways and expensive public transit at the same time, particularly public transit to large park and ride lots, you're creating a worse situation for the climate than you would if you only built those freeways. And that's kind of what we've been doing here in the region. We've been spending there's presently $5 billion worth of freeway construction underway. That's just the South Fraser Perimeter Road and the Highway 1 Port Mann project. The provincial government has just announced that they will build a high-level bridge to replace the Massey Tunnel at a cost of about in the range of $3 billion. And that's largely to fuel capitalist economy, but also to open up the lower Fraser River for coal exports and tar sands oil tankers. And for progressive people, there's a real opportunity to make the connection between radical political change and this rather perhaps mundane physical change away from building highways to public transit oriented cities. U.S. groups, transportation equity, and there's many studies that just show that there's more jobs when you shift from this incredibly energy and capital intensive freeway and car infrastructure and system to a more transit oriented system. And that's where the logic says that the same public investment that's now in the Ministry of Transportation budget, federal and provincial, instead of expanding freeways, and roadways could be going to public transit. In the same way, all of our roads that actually used to largely be dedicated to public transit could once again, and actually we're much more open to the pedestrian and the bicycle, could once again become more available to low carbon transportation modes. Electric public transit, this is showing trolley bus rapid transit that San Francisco has just approved the funding for. And this is Vancouver's separated bike lane on Dunsmuir. And there's a lot of fairly mainstream groups that are pointing out the advantages of making this shift from an, if you will, a physical point of view, an economic point of view. And we've got lots of real world examples. It's a mundane old shot of one of the shoulder bus lanes in Ottawa. And this is BC Transit's version of the efficiency that's gained. And that's, and you could imagine that that's the space that cyclists take up on the road. And that's what they take, everyone with a seat on that ordinary 40-foot bus. And this is what's happening in New York City. We're seeing that you can actually create rapid transit with a can of paint and a digital camera on the front of the bus to issue tickets to anybody that gets in the way of the progress of the bus. And it can be electric. This is Merida, Venezuela. One of the many places that's in the world that's reallocating road space away from the automobile to low carbon modes like transit. A lot of capitalists are very enamored with the battery. 10 years ago, they were very enamored with the battery electric car, the battery bus. 10 years ago, it was the hydrogen fuel cell. There's nothing that can even theoretically beat the efficiency of grid-tied electric transportation where there's actual contacts to the wires. You lose at least 10% charging and discharging a battery, plus the weight of the batteries, plus the energy that goes into creating those. We've got a system that's been working for well over 100 years. It's the most efficient that we can come up with, even in theory. There's actually a lot of ecologically sound ways to electrify and make our transportation system low carbon. And it's largely just the smaller, lighter vehicles for private use, the electric bicycle, electric assist bicycle, the mobility scooter, electric taxis, and electric delivery vehicles that are in use all the time. And interestingly, for longer distance passenger transportation, which I think is an essential part, people aren't going to give up the private automobile willingly if that means they're stuck in the city, can never get out efficiently and in a pleasant way. Siemens, the electrical giant, has just created a trolley system that works at highway speeds. For buses, they're doing it initially for trucks, but quite feasible for buses as well. And of course, with freight, recently our sort of neoliberal system has seen a massive increase in the amount of material moving around the globe, very long distances, but also the amount of materials being consumed and wasted. The disposable economy. Yeah, and we've got lots of efficient modes everywhere in the world. Here in Lower Mainland, our river and the existing rail lines are obvious ones. And I'm going to leave it at this point and just say that meaningful participation is impossible without people knowing the basic options available. And right now we're not there. And however, our provincial government has given us a really interesting opportunity by declaring that we'll have a transit funding referendum by November of 2014.
Before the politicians formulate their transportation questions next year, we, that's you and I, can initiate our own priorities on transportation and select our own choices on nowpolling.ca. Here are some of the already posted initiatives, and you can add your own. Remember, participation is the essence of direct democracy.